to thank everyone for their kind regards as to the relevance of the webinars so far. And hopefully the knowledge that you've gained is already helping you in making decisions about trees and or just changes the way you see trees every day. Both of those are goals. And I think I may have said before that my overall goal for the series is to get consumers educated so they make good choices with their contractors and they hire the right kind of work. And we try to push back against the bad kinds of arboriculture. And we're really going to hit that today because pruning is where it shows up the most, I think. Sure, we get problems with planting trees and we can correct a lot of it, or the trees just don't care. Many times they do care though. But where we see problems every single day in every city of the United States is in pruning. And that's because, because a lot of different people are doing pruning. And I have extremely fond memories as a young teenager doing my first gardening jobs for people and pruning their trees. So I have been interested in pruning trees all of my life. And I have been active conducting pruning, either research studies of it or pruning my own trees, pruning other people's trees, teaching pruning to students and all kinds of aspects of this for about 50 years. And I've watched the industry change. I've watched the science change, and it's still changing. And I think we're going to keep discovering new things about it. I have about a 3-hour lecture that I have tried to distill down to 1 hour. And so I have the salient points, and we're going to cover those like little vignettes, I guess, about pruning. It really is a pretty complicated subject, and we could take it pretty deep. And I do take it deep in this webinar in some places, but I'm going to try and just give you all the tools you need to make good pruning decisions, or to hire people that will make those decisions for you, hopefully. So in the webinar today, we're going to do a quick survey of everybody to see where you're at, what page you're on about pruning. I'm kind of curious what everybody thinks. And so we have 5 slides immediately following this one that speak to this. And then we're going to talk about why we prune, the needs for pruning, a lot of the theory behind pruning, and what it does to and for trees. We're going to talk a little bit about pruning through a tree's lifetime because the needs change. We'll certainly talk about structural pruning, the early years of a tree's life. And we're going to talk about how to recognize a good pruning cut and what makes a good cut and why. And a few comments about painting cuts and other things. And finally, at the end, I'll make a few comments about hiring a pruning contractor if you end up having to do that. So here's our first poll. And Alexa, if you could launch the poll. Looking at this image of a tree, the questions are, how should we prune this tree? Should we cut the top off to create more branching? Should we remove branches from along the stem to thin them out? Or it needs no pruning at this time. So what do you all think? We're going to let this run for a little bit till we get a quantity, and then we'll end it and see where we stand. So young trees actually do need a lot of pruning most of the time. I'm not speaking about this one you see. This has been in the ground for a little bit. But later on in the webinar, we're going to talk about how nurseries treat trees and how they end up in the landscape, and then what we have to end up doing with them. Okay, so we've got about 150 responses. They're still coming in. Take your last whack at it, and we're going to close the poll real quick. I'll let it go up a little bit more. Okay. I'm going to stop it right there. And we're going to share the results. So here you go. Can everybody see the results? I often don't know what you're seeing versus what I'm seeing.
Results are up for us.
Okay. So I think people were pretty good about not cutting the top off. Thank you. We don't cut the top off. And that's one of the cardinal sins of training young trees most of the time. And unfortunately, this is the way we get our mail order fruit trees. They cut the top off because they fit in the box better. And boy, that causes trouble later. Remove branches along the stem. About 37% thought that that was a thing to do. And no pruning at this time. About 62% thought that. And the correct answer for me is C, that this young tree doesn't need a lot of pruning. It might really like having the stake removed. It doesn't need that stake anymore. But for now, the tree can grow and we can deal with its structural needs later. Okay. So I'm going to stop that and go to the next one. So how would you rate this pruning? Alexa, if you would, launch the second poll. And so the choices are acceptable neat pruning, A, not pruned enough, B, or C, unacceptable pruning. Let's see how you think on this. This is a tree, by the way, that I've followed for a few years. And I have some follow-up pictures of it. I'm not sharing them with you today, but it's been interesting to document how the tree responds. So we have some raised hands. Tracy, can you look at that?
I think that maybe people have commented they can't see the image because of the poll, but you should be able to click and drag the poll to either side of your screen.
Yeah, you can move the poll wherever you want it to go. And I'm just waiting till we have about 216 people on the webinar, and I'd like to get as many responses as we can. So we'll let it go up to, we're at 185 right now, so we're closing in. Just give me your gut response, what you think, and then we'll summarize this for you. So. Okay, we're at 191. I'm going to end the polling and share the results. And again, my congratulations. As an audience, you're very astute. Only 5% thought that it was acceptable neat pruning. It's not acceptable pruning. Some thought it was not pruned enough, 3%. 94% said that this is unacceptable pruning, and it is unacceptable. This is called topping, or the use of indiscriminate heading cuts, and that's an important qualifier in this case. The heading cuts were not made in any predetermined way. And I'm going to talk about an exception in pruning where heading cuts are allowed, but they're not indiscriminate. They're very defined and done on purpose, and that'll come a little later in the webinar. So in general, we don't accept topping as a legitimate pruning practice. And this is something we would like you not to contract for if you're having your trees trimmed. And the reason why I'll share with you later, but basically it gets you more work and it's going to require more pruning of you later. Okay, here's a couple of slides that show you two different kinds of cuts. And I want you to give me your opinion on which cut you think is the better cut. So Alexa, if you could roll the poll on this.
I'll wait just a moment so folks can look at the picture. Here comes the poll.
And again, you can grab the top where it says polls and move that wherever you want. I'm moving it over to the right. And you guys are really quick on this. The numbers are going up very fast. And we're already at 163 of 217. And we're closing in fast, 181. Give me your gut impression, which cut you think is best. Okay, we're at 191 as we were before, so I'm going to end the polling here. And I'm going to share the results. And this is not surprising because I have conducted this poll with Master Gardener trainees and for a number of years. And most of my trainees respond the same way as we see here today. You believe that A is the best cut. I mean, it looks neat, but you'll notice that the shape of the cut is oval and it's also very flush. So flush cuts have gone out of style in arboriculture. We do not recommend doing flush cuts now, and I'm going to tell you why in a bit. The other cut is extremely angled. It's at about 45-degree angle to the vertical of the stem. And that's actually the correct cut. And we'll show a little bit later why that is. But we do not want to do flush cuts. These are
James,
essentially harmful to the tree. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you please define a flush cut?
Yes, a flush cut is when, and this branch is taking a curve, and these were probably something we call codominant, but a flush cut is when you cut into the stem above and below where the branch was attached. So branches have a certain biology or morphology. They have something called a collar, and they also have this thing called the branch bark ridge, which you see right here. And you also see right over here. And you want to stay outside the branch bark ridge and you want to stay outside the branch collar. Now the branch collar was removed with the branch, which means that in this case, the cut went into the stem. And that's what we don't want to do. This is going to compromise the ability of the tree to prevent decay from forming. And again, I go into this in a little more detail in a while.
Okay, we might have an issue. Can you hold on just a second? One of the participants is saying that they are seeing the original screen, so they may need to exit and re-enter the webinar. Is that correct? I don't know if others are also having that issue.
Sometimes if your Zoom freezes or whatnot, but Tracy, you're seeing the cut slide, right?
I'm seeing the changing slides correctly.
Yeah.
So if any of the participants are not seeing the slides change, you may have to exit your webinar link and re-enter the same link. Alexa, can you comment, please?
Yeah, many are commenting that they're seeing the, slide that Jim is speaking about. So I think that's just that one particular person. So I would suggest, as Tracy said, logging out and reconnecting.
Okay, so here's the fourth poll. We'll have this one and one more, and then we'll go into the more informative part of the presentation. Right now, we're kind of picking your brain and seeing what you think. So the question is, what does this tree require? A, little or no pruning. B, some pruning. Or C, extensive pruning, including height reduction cuts. So Alexa, if you could put the poll up. And we've had some time to think about it and people are right on it. Thank you for being so decisive. And when we get up to around 190 or so, I'll cut it off and we'll share the results. Okay, 192, it's still moving right along, so I'll give it a few more seconds. We've gotten 230 people on the webinar now. Some have joined in later. And for those who joined us a little late, we are surveying your knowledge about pruning right now. And we have one more poll to go, and then we will start the educational part of the webinar. So I'm stopping at 205 and share the results. So 67% of the audience, About 2/3 felt that little or no pruning was required, and that is the correct answer. The tree has well-spaced branches that are not larger than the stem they're attached to. They're spaced also around the tree and up and down the tree. So really, nothing needs to be done here. And certainly extensive pruning is not required. So we're going to stop this one. And the final poll will come in the next slide. And here it is. This is a Quercus lobata, the valley oak that grows in the inland valleys of California. And it's an old tree. It is deciduous, so it's not dead. And it's in the winter when the leaves have all come off, and it's very healthy. So this tree is A, too large, B, is just right, or C, could continue to grow some more. So Alexa, let's have the poll. One 160 of 230, 180. And give us your fresh opinion, what your gut opinion is on this. 197. A few more remarks are going to come in. Okay. Looks like the bars aren't changing too much. Take your last shot. Okay, 206 out of 229. And end the poll and share the results. And I don't know if you've realized it, but these questions in the survey are very leading, because what I want to know is whether you think trees can be too large or threatening. And so certainly 30% of our audience today believes, yes, this is too large for my comfort. Some people say it's just about right. And about 30% say it could grow some more. My opinion, whether it's right or wrong, this is getting to that part of pruning where it becomes an opinion, is that it could grow some more. That trees grow continuously through their lifetime, and they will continue to get larger. So does it need to be pruned? It depends on whether or not you live in that house under it, right? If you don't live in that house, then yeah, it can grow a lot more. It's a gorgeous tree. It's one of our penultimate Quercus lobata, and its health has been preserved because I know the owner of the house, and I have told him under no conditions should you prune anything green off that oak tree, and he hasn't. And the tree continues to thrive and do well. So we're going to stop. Okay. So what are the goals of pruning? You know, people have different goals. And I guess the question is, do trees need to be pruned? No, they don't need to be pruned. No tree needs to be pruned. The correct point here is that you may need to prune the tree. The tree does not need you to prune it. And the reasons for pruning are variable. So depending on the kind of tree it is, if it's a fruit tree, you might be pruning for production, to increase the quality of fruit or something of that matter. If it's an ornamental tree, you might be pruning for some aesthetic that you have. And if it's a tree in a forest, nobody is going to prune it. It's just going to grow in the forest. And things will happen to it that might self-prune, but nobody is going to go out there and prune that tree. And so before horticulture evolved, before people even thought of pruning things, trees were not pruned. So they don't need to be pruned. But if we choose to prune them, what are the consequences? Well, pruning is going to take away photosynthetic capacity. It's going to reduce or retard growth. And that is the major effect of pruning. I'm going to give you a few core principles today, and this is one of them. The more you prune something, the less it will grow. And I know some people may not get that right away. It's not obvious or intuitive in many ways, but we're going to reinforce that point through the webinar. The other thing is we might be trying to maintain health and vigor by removing diseased or damaged or storm broken or ice storm broken branches, or branches that didn't grow the way we want them to. Those are all legitimate reasons to prune. And certainly if we need to, we should do that. Now, as I've intimated, I'm out here in Arizona and I have an orchard. And in that orchard, these photos were all taken at various winters. And the dates don't indicate the date of the photo, they indicate when the tree was planted. So we have a couple that were planted in 1985 on the right, and you can see that they've suffered, in the case of the peach on the far right, horrendous pruning cuts over the years. And the tree was pruned up high and is at a point where you can't even reach the fruit. The pear tree in the second to the right is much less pruned. It looks like a shrub, it's so busy. And so it's had very little pruning. In 2018 and 2021, those fruit trees that were recently planted in the orchard have not been pruned at all. And they will not be pruned for several years. And so why is this? Why don't I just prune things right away? And when the nursery person sells you a tree, they always want to prune it for you. Don't let them. They ruin trees doing that. Do not let them take away the terminal bud. This is a cardinal sin in pruning, unless it's meeting your own objective. If you have an objective that you want to do that, fine. But most of the time it gets us in deeper trouble.
Can you restate for the listeners one more time the concept language of less, the more you prune, the less the tree grows?
Yes, and I have an actual slide that details that, but and I will reinforce that point again. But the part of the tree you prune on is the part of the tree that will grow the least. And we don't think about it, but we're not just cultivating the above ground part, we're cultivating the root system. And in a young tree, you just planted a bare root tree perhaps, or maybe it was from a container, but the root system is probably compromised from harvest. There are not as many roots as you want, and you need to cultivate that root system. In order for a tree to do well, the roots have to supply the shoots. And it would seem that compensatory pruning would be good. Like, oh, I've got a tree that was just harvested, I should harvest off some of the top so that it doesn't suffer. Just the opposite is true. We do not want to do compensatory pruning on newly planted trees. The tree needs all of the buds that it has because they're going to produce auxin. Auxin is going to flow down the stem to the roots and it's going to stimulate the formation of more roots. The more active buds we have in a young tree, the more root stimulation we're going to get and the quicker it will establish. So you do not want to prune off the branches or the buds unless they're damaged. And you certainly do not want to take out the terminal bud because it's seminal in deciding the architecture of the tree. Furthermore, in some trees, like in plums, taking out the terminal bud on a young whip will stunt that tree, sometimes for years. And I know this because I have 2 stunted trees that I bought by mail, and I couldn't stop them from pruning off the terminal bud. And now those trees have not grown well. One thing you should always be aware of is that pruning is wounding. And this is black and white, no picture, it's just right there in your face. I want you to remember pruning equals wounding. You are always wounding when you prune something off, unless it's dead wood and the tree doesn't care. And I'll talk about deadwoods particularly later, but every time you create a wound, you potentially create an opening for pathogens to come in, or you create a place where insects might be attracted to enter the tree. So pruning is wounding, and we want to limit wounding, particularly exposing the older cells of the tree, like the heartwood, to the potential for pathogens to come in and attack it. So decay fungi that get in trees require wounds to enter. And the size of the wound will determine to a certain degree the amount of decay that forms. So this is a fresh cut that was made on this avocado. And this is an old cut. And you see that there's wound tissue forming over it. But this was exposed and this is all discolored. How did that discolored wood happen? Well, that's because decay fungi got in here and moved around and have already started to invade this other branch. And so these cuts are the entryway for fungi that cause disease. And in this case, this is probably a canker pathogen called Botrisphaeria, and it's going to kill this branch eventually. Of course, my chainsaw killed it first, but never mind that. So the sum of all the pruning wounds on a tree approximates the volume of wood that will be eventually destroyed by rot fungi. So if you kind of look at a tree and you add up all those pruning wounds on a big old tree, and you think about what that means for the wood inside that tree, it means that there are a lot of coalescing columns of decay that are coming together in the main stem. The fungi are actually interacting, and that's quite complicated, but they're causing rot. And the architecture of the sapwood is breaking down. I'm sorry, of the heartwood. And depending on what organisms get in there, the sapwood or the conductive wood of the tree could also be influenced. And so large wounds are typically bad for trees. We don't want to be making cuts of this size. And very often in agriculture, they do anyway, particularly in avocado culture. Okay, so I'm going to try and advance the slide. For some reason, my slide doesn't want to advance. Okay. So this concept that I'm showing you here is from Kevin Smith, who's a forest pathologist in Durham, New Hampshire, works for the U.S. Forest Service. And he's basically saying that energy flows through trees. It's captured by the leaves. It's converted to sugar. It's stored in the wood. And then organisms that can get inside that wood use that energy for their own purposes and basically turn that, eventually end up turning that entire tree into humus. And so the end point of this process is the sunlight energy captured by trees turns into soil. And this is a natural process, and no tree can withstand it forever. Eventually, wounds happen, branches break, fungi enter the tree one way or another, and they begin to decay it while it's still standing, while it's still alive. And then when it falls down on the ground, they really go after it. So this is a natural process. And in our pruning, we want to avoid accelerating this process. We want to get our pruning objectives met without letting a lot of these destructive kinds of organisms get in there and accelerate the process of turning our tree into mulch. And I think the thing you have to remember is that wood is an energy storage tissue. And so in this series of slides, the one in the middle shows a section of the sapwood stained with iodine, and the purple dots are stored starch. The other white parts are conductive tissue that don't store starch, but you can see here, this wood is storing starch. The one on the left is showing you a very interesting piece of wood where the sapwood is stained black. That means it's rich in stored energy. But the very center of the tree is a blacker black, which is a cavity. There's just a hole there. And then these other colors show some insect damage. And then this clearing zone, the very white and lighter. And then the last ring of annual growth is nice and dark. This is where the most energy in the tree is. This is the action of fungi growing into that tissue and absorbing that stored energy for their own bodies and rotting out the center of the tree. The picture on the very right over here is showing advanced disease and decay inside of a stem and discoloration. And probably the only stored energy is just in these couple of spots here where there's healthy tissue. So these stems are very attractive to a number of fungi that can get in there and not only absorb the energy from the wood, but break the wood down and decompose it while the tree is still alive. And you don't know this is happening because from the outside, a branch like this one on the left, it looks completely normal. You would have no idea that's in there. And so part of our goals in pruning is to try and avoid this from happening. Another thing you need to know, this is just the most basic core tenet that feeds into what Tracy asked me to explain a little bit more in depth. So here it comes. And that is that pruning removes leaves. It removes leaves and it removes buds. And buds are the potential to have leaves. If you don't have buds, you're not going to make leaves. If you prune out branches with buds, you're pruning out leaves. If you prune out leaves, you're pruning out the energy making component. You're pruning out the solar array. It's like going up on your roof and saying, I'm going to take off this solar cell and that solar cell. You're going to thin out all those solar cells. Well, you're going to have less energy made. The same thing in trees. So the part of the tree that you take out the solar cells, that's the part that doesn't grow so well. You've taken away the energy production material, the leaves, and that slows down the growth of the tree. This is why pruning is a growth retarding process. You take away the leaves, you slow down the capture of energy. You take away the energy, you take away the growth. And this is why we don't indiscriminately over prune trees, because it reduces their capability of growing. And after all, we want them to grow, right? That's the point of them. And so pruning removes stems. It removes not only the buds and the leaves that were going to form, but the energy that was stored in those stems is removed. So it's not available to the rest of the tree. Pruning is also wounding. So here you see me in this tree cutting that branch off. I'm creating a gigantic wound there. If I left the tree that way, that branch would certainly become infected. Wounds are infection courts. Plant pathologists use the word infection court to signify an opening that can provide entry. Now, most trees, if they're intact, the heartwood that some fungi like to eat is unget-to-able. They can't get to it. And so the fungi don't invade those trees. But if there's an opening, if there's a wound or a break or damage, then the heartwood can be infected. Pruning redirects the allocation of energy and tree hormones. So by making cuts like this, we allow more light to penetrate the canopy. That invigorates buds and causes the tree to redirect its growth in different ways than it would have if you hadn't pruned it. And that could be good or it could be not good, depending on what happened. Another thing to realize is that pruning types and strategies and amounts are different at different tree ages. So when a tree is a seedling or a very young tree, little or no pruning will be done as long as somebody hasn't already pruned it and caused it to be messed up and then requiring it to be fixed. And we'll talk about that because that's usually the typical thing. But if it's a seedling growing on its own and it hasn't been molested by nurserymen, then no pruning. And now as the tree gets larger and starts to develop, there may be structural pruning required. And one of the things I've learned in my own research recently is how big an impact the genetics of the tree have on the requirement of structural pruning. So depending on the taxon that you're growing, it may inherently have to have structural pruning just because of the way the branches are produced. Other trees, less so. So as the tree approaches mid-age or early, late, let's say adolescent tree or teenager tree, it may be requiring some correction in its growth patterns. As the tree becomes mature and the canopy is set, the major scaffold branches are in place, nothing is changing there. What it comes down to is deadwood removal. And I have deadwood removal in parentheses because it's giving an homage to the fact that deadwood is a part of the tree as well. And whether we like the deadwood there or not, the ecology that surrounds that tree requires deadwood. And so our decision to remove deadwood has to be based on some logic or reasoning other than I just don't like the look of it. And if that's your reason, fine, go ahead. But you're probably depriving somebody of a home or an opportunity in that canopy. And I'll say some words about that toward the end. So now I'm getting to two slides that are the universal responses to pruning. The universal response 1, universal response 2. And these apply to all trees and actually to all plants. And so you can apply this anywhere. Pruning retards the growth of the plant, the entire plant, or the part of the plant that is pruned the most. This is because pruning removes leaves and it removes the stored carbohydrates in the plant. So the more you prune it, the less it will grow. And that's something that you have to always keep in mind. The choices you make in pruning determine what will grow and what won't grow. So a couple of examples. This is over thinning and heading and topping. And the second universal response to pruning is that it invigorates dormant, latent, and auxiliary buds. So buds that would not normally grow, if trees are over thinned or headed and topped, will be released to grow. Another way of looking at it is that if you take a bunch of buds out of a tree, all the ones that are left will get more vigor. They have the same size root system and they have the same water resources and nutrient resources coming into the tree than before it was pruned. So buds that would not normally grow because they're in shade or because there was enough auxin being produced by the terminal buds to keep them dormant are now released and they will begin to grow. So while this kind of pruning seems stimulatory, like it's causing growth to happen, if we compared trees that were not pruned to ones that were pruned in either of these capacities, the not pruned trees would grow larger on their main stem. So the main trunk would get bigger faster than the pruned trees. And if you think about this for a while, it's pretty obvious. You take away the energy factories of the tree, you take away the ability to produce growth because energy is directly converted to growth. A tree cannot grow without energy. The more energy it has, the more it will grow. If it has to make up for lost canopy and lost energy production by loss of buds and leaves, then it's going to put energy into that, not necessarily growing the entire organism back. Okay. So this is the theory of pruning. Neither of these pruning jobs is acceptable pruning, by the way. Thinning for its own sake went out of standards and is not considered good practice unless there's a specific reason for it. Trees will often tolerate over thinning, but they will also cause latent buds to form. Branches will occur that will need to be maintained later. You may have to go back in and remove a lot of things you wouldn't have had to if you didn't do this kind of pruning. So both of these situations of pruning end up costing more money long-term if you have serious intent about maintaining the quality of your tree, because you're going to have to come in next year and fix everything that grows back. So invigorating buds is not necessarily a good thing. It may lead to a lot more work in the future. And here's a good example, and I just call it consequences. This is a Tipuana tipu tree, and these are legumes. They grow very quickly, and this is 1 year's regrowth after topping. And you see this Medusa head of branches that has grown here. These cannot sustain themselves. They are not natural attachments. They will grow too large, they will break, they'll fall out of the tree canopy. And furthermore, this is not the architecture the tree would normally develop. The pruning has altered it by releasing for growth latent or auxiliary buds that have now grown in no particularly preordained way. And so we have disrupted the natural architecture of the tree. And this would require, if we want to get these trees back to a normal form, consistent pruning every year for a number of years to recorrect this problem. If we just hadn't topped the trees in the first place, we wouldn't be in this mix. We could have dealt with the form of the tree in a much better way. So the need for corrective pruning increases, and this costs you more money. Or if you don't do anything about it, you just let it grow, the branches will fall off and damage things underneath, and that will cost you money. So the cost of pruning increases when you do it wrong. Now, I want to say a word about this because some of you may have been to Europe, and particularly Italy, where they're the masters of this pollarding method. This is in Amsterdam, Netherlands. And here we see trees that look like they've been headed back, but they're not. You see these rather club-like appendages. These are the swollen ends where the branches grow back every year, and then they are pruned back to these knobs every year. So all the growth is removed every single year. And again, the topping kinds of pruning, and this is a kind of topping, but we call it pollarding, it is labor intensive. It requires work every year. You cannot skip a year, because if you do, branches will fall out. They're not well attached. So this kind of pruning predetermines your practice. It's saying, yes, every year I'm going to go in, I'm going to prune back to those knobs. This also requires species that are capable of enduring it. So not every tree will like this. You're basically constantly creating wounds, and the tree's ability to limit decay in those knobs and keep it from going into the main stem, that's genetic. Some trees can do it and some can't. You try this on a Siberian elm and you're not going to get very far, okay? Or a maple. Maples don't tolerate this. But on sycamores, London plane trees, and a few other trees, yeah, this can be done. It's because the species chosen is tolerant of the practice. So pruning is the removal of leaves, buds, and stems to achieve some objective. And that terminal bud, as it turns out, is critical in developing the architecture of the plant, particularly if it's a plant that wants to grow tall and sort of keep a dominant terminal bud in place. There are a number of different kinds of trees that have that natural shape. Some other trees grow more wide or dome shape, and the terminal bud loses its impact very shortly after the lateral buds start to grow. In those cases, the terminal bud is less important, and the effects of topping will be, I would say, a little less destructive. But at the end of the day, you find yourself in the tree and you're asking questions. What do I prune? Or maybe another way to look at this is, what do I not prune? And this is really it's almost a philosophical question. And in pruning my trees, I often will be going, am I pruning just to remove defective things I don't like? Or am I pruning to encourage the growth of things that I do like, that I want to grow more? So remember, what you prune will grow less, but what you do not prune will grow more. And this is really critical to see this while you're in the tree, or while your tree trimmer doing your trees is in the tree. If there's a part of that tree you're trying to encourage, for God's sake, don't let anybody prune it. You want to leave it alone. It needs to have the most leaves it can have to produce the most energy to convert to growth and grow more. So I think a lot of times we have this backwards. We're looking at trees as full of faulty parts and cutting out the parts we don't like. We should be looking at trees in terms of what we want to grow and what we want to leave alone. So the training of trees starts in the nursery, and it starts with a tree much like this. If I could get all of my trees like that, this would be heaven, because the architecture is unhampered. The tree has not grown lateral branches yet, and nobody cut off the terminal bud to make them grow. So if this tree is planted like that and left alone, it will more or less develop its branches in the way that it's genetically predetermined to do that. And I can work with that. I can structure the perfect tree with that whip. Okay, so most of our tree training systems for landscape trees use a central leader, and they have branches coming off of it. And that produces the strongest arrangement or architecture for the canopy of the tree. Unfortunately, what happens more often than not is the nursery heads back the whip. That results in axillary buds that are preformed are released to grow. And you see they've grown in a very close arrangement. That gets planted out in the landscape, and this is what we have. We have all these branches coming from one point. If we look down the road to years later when that tree fails, we realize that all branches coming from one point is a failure point. It was created in the nursery, planted in the landscape, cultivated until the tree couldn't take it anymore, and the tree fails. So understanding branch faults is actually key to understanding structural pruning of young trees, and especially trees that come out of nurseries. So we want to look for certain things. This is an example of all branches from one point in the picture. And it's not a sustainable architecture for most trees, although some can get quite large before the failure occurs. The other things that we see are codominant stems, where I'll show you the stems are the same size. It looks like a tuning fork. Or the branch is the same size as the stem as it attaches to, whatever the angle. Generally, those do not have good attachment. And finally, if there is something called included bark, which I'll show you. So structural pruning results from this understanding of the tree failures and what makes a weak branch attachment. So weak branch attachments are where the branch and the stem are the same size. And in the case on the picture on the left, it's a classic codominant. That is, there's two stems that have the same dominance, and neither one is any bigger than the other. So there's really a poor attachment between them. And what we see, this bulge here, this is the beginning of something called included bark. And what this means is the bark has rolled inside of the attachment, particularly up here. So there's really no connection from one side of the stem to the other at this point. As these get larger and larger and push against each other and get heavier, eventually one will break away and you'll have a failure. So how do we do this? We have to correct this when the tree is young, or if the tree is this size, we choose one of the stems to be less dominant that we don't want to grow. And what do? We prune it. And what do we do with the other one? We leave it alone. We don't prune it because we want it to get bigger. And then it will grow out of the codominant situation. And so this is something that I detailed in a research project in the 1990s. The paper was published in Hort Science. And so here you see two stems. They're the same size. This is what we would call codominant. And these are just young stems in coast live oaks. And in this pair, this one is bigger than that one. They started out the same size. This one was headed back. So it was the ultimate pruning cut. It's like chop it off right there and see what happens. Well, it really slowed it down. But look at this bud that grew that basically regrew the whole stem in the year time that elapsed. So even though it grew crazily to make up the growth rate, the ending stem diameter here is much less than it is here, even though they started out the same. So the thing that you prune is the one that's going to grow less, even though it grows back. And the one you leave unpruned is the one that will become more dominant. So how do we do this practically? Making the cut, making a good cut is the first step in pruning trees, shrubs, and vines, and even roses or anything. And what is a good cut? Well, certainly a good cut is not one that peels the bark off the remaining part. And so we have practice, we have a way to do this so that injury doesn't occur to the tree. The goal is to achieve the growth retardation and reduce the size of certain parts of the tree without introducing excessive amounts of decay. And how do we do that? One is we keep the cuts small. Let's not be pruning large branches. Try to prune parts of the tree, preferably make more cuts, but smaller cuts, and make them more frequently over time. So have your trees trimmed frequently, but don't have big cuts made. And this will get your objectives done in pruning without introducing a lot of decay. So the two kinds of cuts we could possibly make are heading cuts, which are indiscriminate cutting back. Topping is another way of calling it, but just cutting a main stem back at some point. And this is a very sloppy cut. There's nothing good about this. Or thinning cuts. And notice I'm in this slide, this is on a peach or something. It's a very small cut. This is not going to introduce decay. This is on an avocado, and it's a very large cut, and decay will certainly be introduced. So large heading cuts are anathema to tree pruning. You don't want to do it. Small cuts, more of them, done more frequently to achieve pruning objectives by thinning or removing whole branches where they attach to the stem are going to achieve your objective without introducing decay and other pathogens. So poor cuts are generally indiscriminate. Heading cuts, they're large cuts, and they're poorly executed cuts. So here we see a very, very, very flush cut, and this is really bad. And I'm about to tell you why it's really bad. So when we make flush cuts, and by flush we mean that they're cut in line with the main stem. There's no projection of the branch collar. So this is the branch bark ridge, and it's about 40 degrees angled from the flush line of the stem. Theory suggests we should angle our cut about the same amount out, so about a 40-degree projection outward. That's where the cut should have been made, but it was made flush. And what happens, this is actually the same tree looked at from the other angle, and we have decay coming in. We have no callus growth. We have callus growth on this side, but very little above and below the flush cut because we have cut off the branch collar. The branch collar is where the tree regenerates wound tissue to cover over the cut. And you'll also notice that this cut in particular is an oval. And that is a bad sign. If you see oval cuts in a tree, that means somebody's cut the branch collars off and the cuts are too flush. They do not regenerate at the same speed. So how do we make a cut without damaging the tree? It's called a three-part cut. You make an undercut is the first part. Then you make a weight reduction cut and it cuts and it peels back to the undercut and pops away. Then you make the final cut and notice the cut is quite angled. It's not flush. Now on avocado, you do not see a branch collar, but you do see a branch bark ridge. Here it is. The branch collar is not obvious. Branch collars are very obvious in alder and in some, most conifers show the branch collar well because there are rings called shoulder rings that define it. And you just see it, you know where to cut because it's very clear. But when it's not clear, you have to define the cut using the branch bark ridge. And so if you do this correctly, you will have circular cut geometry where you're just cutting the branch. You're not cutting the stem under the branch. If you have oval cut geometry, you have cut into the stem, you have compromised the stem, and you have basically made it harder for the tree to limit decay because of the geometry of the cut. So this was all laid out in a handout by Dr. Alex Shigo called Natural Target Pruning. And this is from his original handout. And I just got a protractor out and I found out what the cut angles are. So this is, the flush line is parallel to the main stem. Then you just angle what he's suggesting, and it's about 32 degrees in this image, 35 over here, about 35 there. And it's showing here the branch bark ridge, which is this, and then these rings, which are called shoulder rings. So this is the branch collar. This is what we want to leave on the tree. We don't want to cut that. And it's shown very well over in the lower right here. These projections on a conifer are showing you exactly what you want to leave and not cut. And again, this lump here is the branch collar. We don't want to cut that. We want to take this angle from the parallel line to the branch bark ridge, extend it over, and we make an angled cut. So this whole theory of how to make a good cut evolved last century, and it's been well accepted and adopted pretty much by professional arborists worldwide. And it has also been shown that it limits the movement of decay in trees. And so we want to make cuts in this way. So the branch biology then dictates where the cut will be. So we have codominance here. One is the same size as the other. This is something that could fail. So this is in an orchard, we decided to cut one off. Here's the branch bark ridge. As I told you, it's very hard to see the branch collar, but here's the flush line, and we'll make some geometry. As we see here, the branch bark ridge, the flush line, move the angle over, make the cut like that, and lo and behold, it comes out a perfect circle. This is a well-crafted cut. It should be circular, not ovular. So if we had just cut flush, it would be a giant oval, would have cut behind the branch collar that we can't see, and it would have compromised the tree's ability to contain decay. And I'm coming up to that very close now. Here we are. So it turns out that branches and stems have inherent, which something we call constitutive defense against wood decay organisms and canker organisms like Botrisphaeria dothidia here in the little leaf fig, Ficus microcarpa. And we see this discolored tissue. This is the fungally infected canker tissue, and it's trying to get into the main stem. And this area here is the branch collar, and it is basically stopping the movement of decay, impeding it, slowing it down, and keeping it from getting infected. So that this again is a tree's constitutive defense. Trees, based on their taxonomy, their genetics, have different abilities this way. Some are good compartmentalizers. In other words, they can keep the decay away. Some are less good and they rot easily, like maples and elms and oaks. Oaks rot very easily as well. One way to really accelerate the movement of decay is to cut out the branch bark or the branch collar, because this is where the protective constitutive defenses are. If we cut behind the branch collar, the tree has no defenses, the decay moves right in, and then you're going to really compromise it. Okay, so you got your good cuts done. What about painting those cuts? These products, I took these pictures off the internet just a week or two ago. These things are out there. You can buy them. You can use them. You shouldn't use them. We stopped using pruning paints 30 years ago, and yet the products are still sold. And here is a picture from my friend Igor Singer in Ukraine. And it's showing a wound that's been assiduously painted for years. And he's just peeling it back, showing you the mushrooms that have formed in the cavity under the pruning paint. And so this pruning paint did nothing to stop this infection. And what we know is that pruning paints can actually accelerate some infections. You're basically keeping that cut surface wet or moist under there, and you would want it to dry out. Of course, you would not want to make a cut this size in any way, shape, or form on any tree that you have care about. You would want to have, dealt with this big branch earlier before it got to be so big. Okay. So one of the exceptions, of course, in agriculture, we use paints to prevent sunburn. And in this case, these citrus are being top worked to different varieties. And when you cut the canopy off of a tree, holy moly, that causes a lot of disturbance. And more than anything, there's a huge amount of light penetration and the tree will sunburn. So white latex paint or perhaps kaolin clay, but probably white latex paint in this case has been used to protect the young stems from sunburn. So this is a time when these aren't really pruning paints, but where paint could be used correctly. So I want to say a few things about deadwood.
Before you move on, James,
What's that?
before
Yes.
you move on, can you speak to using wound coverings in other parts of the country, specifically such as oaks in Texas, where it's commonly applied?
Yes. So where we have oak wilt, such as in Texas and some other pathogens, there has been specific research on incorporating fungicides in pruning paints to slow the spread of that pathogen. Those are legitimate uses of pruning paints. And of course, you know, pesticide laws have to be followed and all that. But just the, you know, use it because you think you need to use it, use of pruning paints is not recommended. And so unless you're facing something like oak wilt, that's a different story. So here's a picture. I took this today. This is out in Portal, Arizona. And it's showing you a big 10-inch log of dead wood in this Platanus wrightii, Arizona sycamore, up about 40 feet up in the canopy of this tree. Most people would say, we got to get that out of there. But you notice that there are holes in it. This is habitat for the acorn woodpecker. And you can't see it, but it's also riddled with smaller holes because it's a granary. And so the wood is being used by the acorn woodpecker to store its food. This area of Arizona in the Chiricahua Mountains, Cave Creek Canyon in particular, has a higher density of raptors than anywhere else in the world. And the reason why is because there are sycamore trees here, and there are fungi that eat those sycamores and cause deadwood, and these birds utilize it. It is an essential part of the ecosystem. And these things are connected. Owls use the holes left behind by acorn woodpeckers. And the owls in turn eat the kangaroo rats and the pack rats and the other things that run around out here. And the entire system is kept in balance because this deadwood is here. Now in Ojai, where I have my other residence, California, we have a horrendous rat problem in the city of Ojai. And rats are just overrunning everything. They eat everything. They eat all the fruit. They eat all the chicken feed if they can get at it. They'll even eat the chickens if they stop moving. And why do we have a horrendous rat problem? Because we don't have any concern for cultivating deadwood in Ojai. Deadwood occurs in a tree, people cut it out. They cut out the habitat for acorn woodpeckers and for owls. And they take away the ability of owls to nest and reproduce. And then we get an imbalance of rats. And so these things are connected. You have to be sympathetic to the ecology that trees provide our environment, whether it's in a forest or in an urban setting. And we are, as a profession, and I'm glad to see this happening, reevaluating the necessity of removing logs like this from trees. In this tree's case, it poses no threat. If that chunk falls out of the tree, it's just going to land on the ground and nobody's going to be there to be hurt by it. So I'm certainly not going to take that out of my tree. I'm going to leave it there. It's an important part of the ecology of that tree. So summarizing today, we have some do's and don'ts. Try to make the smallest wounds possible and prune frequently so that the wounds do not need to be large. Do your structural pruning early before branch faults become large cuts. Pay attention to the branch biology when making the cuts. Make good cuts. Conserve the healthy canopy foliage, especially in older trees. Older trees, particularly if they're struggling, need every leaf they've got. The idea of retrenchment pruning to invigorate old trees is pretty much unsubstantiated by science. Think about what not to prune. Don't just think about what to prune. Think about what you want to encourage to grow, and then don't prune it. On the don't side, don't thin trees just to thin trees, just because that's what you think you need to do. You would thin trees for a reason. Trees can tolerate thinning. Some trees are incredibly tolerant of thinning. Chinese elm can be laced out every year for its entire life and never suffer. Other trees less so. Some oak trees are particularly intolerant of thinning. So have a reason for why you're doing things. Don't do it just to do it. Don't remove over 50% of the foliage in large trees. This is stunting the entire tree, potentially predisposing it to disease. Don't cover wounds with pruning paints. It doesn't help with decay. Don't make very large cuts, no topping. Don't disrespect the branch biology, the branch collars. Don't make flush cuts ever. And remove deadwood. Don't remove deadwood without a good reason to remove it, because it's an essential part of the ecology of trees. With that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Tracy, I'll bet you have a bunch of questions saved up.
Hardly any.
Dang. Well, we can just all go home right now then.
So there are lots of interesting pruning questions that I left for you. I mostly answered the structural questions. So this is an anonymous attendee who is asking you, wondering if cutting back a second leader, the part of the tree that's the tallest, how far do I need to cut it back just to where it's shorter than the leader or further? So that depends, right? So
yeah, you know, a lot of that depends. Like if I see a picture, I could tell you right now. And those are good follow-ups on email. I can give you some guidance that way.
you might want to just kind of peripherally talk about that guidance, because there are several questions that relate to this. And I think you could answer or set up to answer those questions by responding.
So a lot of people are concerned with the height of their tree. In fact, I had a webinar attendee contact me privately about his tree, sent pictures, and we had a really nice discussion about it. And I told him his tree looked fine, and he was worried about it damaging a lanai if it fails. And I said, hey, get a qualified arborist there. And what does that mean? It means International Society of Arboriculture, ISA, certified arborist, and have the tree evaluated by that professional person. The questioner contacted one, had the arborist come out, and the arborist said, you don't need to do anything to your tree. It's fine. And so I told him, and I think it's true, you know, you paid for his knowledge and his expertise, and it's worth something. You saved yourself a lot of problems by not pruning the tree, and you also saved yourself the cost of pruning you didn't need to do. So nonetheless, people are concerned about height. And how do we cut a tree back? Kind of like in the title slide that I'm looking at now, but you guys don't see. There is a process called drop crotching, and that's where you take a terminal shoot and you cut it back to a side branch. Thank you, Tracy. And what we want to do is not cut so much off the top that the tree responds with a bunch of wild shoots that grow from where you cut, called epicormic branches. And so if you can cut back and whatever you leave reassumes the dominant role for the tree, then you have reduced the height without causing a systemic response that messes the tree up. And so this just takes skill, practice, and knowledge of lots of species of trees and how they respond.
Well, this is true. We're also talking about reducing a dual leader, it sounds like. So that's
okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the nuance. Thank you. So when you have a codominant and one of them needs to be reduced, yes, tuning fork, you can go through and make thinning cuts on the one that you don't want to grow and just keep thinning it. Do a lot of it. Every time it grows, thin it some
Maybe we
more.
should do this finger.
Yeah. And eventually it will shrink because the one you don't prune will grow more.
So what happens with the energy when you do that?
Well, the energy in the stem that you're pruning gets somewhat depleted because that stem is drawing on its internal reserve to grow its shoots, to grow back what you cut off, and it's depleting itself. The other stem is still full. Now, some of that energy could theoretically move from the unpruned stem into the pruned one. And trees have that capability. But the connections are probably pretty poor in a strong codominant that's very upright to send that energy into the phloem, down around the bend and back up the other side. So generally speaking, if we thin out one codominant and leave the other alone, the one we prune will shrink. The other one will just grow more. It doesn't actually shrink. It's just the other one grows more.
So it's sort of a gradual process, and it
It
sort of
is.
distributes the energy, but it's not in the way that most people think of, correct?
Correct. And another thing I often tell students in, longer lectures is don't try to achieve all your pruning objectives in one season, because you're not going to with something like that. That kind of a thing is going to take a number of years to shift the balance, but it can be done. And so, some people would say, oh, we have a codominant, just cut off one of them. And the problem with that is you've introduced a huge wound right at an attachment, a former attachment, and you're going to get decay and it's going to go on the other side. And then, years down the line, you might have a failure on the thing you left behind. So it's always better to work with what you have, alter the ratios. And scientist Ed Gilman calls it the aspect ratio. I don't use that terminology, but alter the ratio of the two branch sizes to one another.
So also in that case, you would be concerned a little bit with sunburn injury to a lot of tissue removal at once. So it's a complicated multifactorial thing, right?
Absolutely, Tracy. And the thing is, if you're taking a 6-inch branch out of a tree somewhere, that's a huge canopy chunk that's going to introduce sunlight. And if whatever that sunlight hits isn't used to it, it's going to burn. You're going to get cankers. You're going to get disease coming in on unintended parts. And boy, if you really want to see this, just go to an apple orchard where somebody's done that. And apples don't tolerate this.
We have
They sunburn like crazy.
So I'm going to ask these two questions to you simultaneously because they're semi-related. Do you feel coral trees, due to their fragile build, need trimming? And that's, I have feelings on that myself. Pruning seems to be at odds versus apple trees production where pruning needs to be done. Apple production.
Can you condense that into a question for me?
I think so. I think the question is, pruning of apple trees seems to impair fruiting because they fruit on spur wood. So
yeah, so there's a couple of sides to that. It depends on how old the tree is, obviously. An old mature apple tree has a lot of spurs, and if you prune the spurs out, then you don't get the fruit. A young, just a very juvenile apple tree may have a lot of unproductive wood. The spurs haven't formed yet, and if you take off the terminal buds, it will release latent buds that could turn into spurs. And so that process of pruning tipping out the tree, pruning the tall shoots of an apple, will actually cause spurs to form. So early in the life of an apple tree, yes, we're doing heading cuts, essentially, maybe small ones, just taking out the terminal bud. They don't have to be big cuts, and that will form spurs. In an old tree, like I have some here in Portal, I have an old apple tree that was so spurred out, it was nothing but spurs. There was no active, vigorous growth. And I actually went through there cutting those spurs off to release some buds that I could get some more vegetative growth. So these pruning requirements change with need and age.
So I kind of left this one because this is near and dear to our heart due to that recent pruning of oaks in Ojai that we witnessed from our friend Jen Scow. Here in Ojai, some significant topping of tall eucalyptus trees near the intersection of California 33 and 150.
Oh, boy.
I think it is along the property Ojai Valley Inn.
That's
Will they
correct.
get more bushy? Will the pruning eventually kill the trees? Is this an acceptable way of bringing down the height of a very tall eucalyptus tree?
My immediate answer is it's never acceptable. And it's not acceptable in that case. And they should just remove the trees and start over. Because what they have done now is they have caused very large wounds on a vigorous tree that's going to want to regrow. It's going to send up shoots. And if they don't get after those shoots every year, eucalyptus have the potential of growing rapidly enough, even in drought conditions, to put on significant wood that's big enough that is going to strike cars when they fall on Highway 33. So basically, they have created 200 feet of hazardous trees, and that's just plain reckless. And it's bad arboriculture, and it's bad tree stewardship on the part of the Ojai Valley Inn. So, and it's bad because it's in the right of way of Highway 33 of Caltrans to let them do it. It's bad, bad, bad. It's bad for the agency. It's bad for the trees. It's bad for the inn. It's bad for whoever the F did that work. And I actually saw him doing it. So I saw the trucks.
It's
And they
bad
were
for
somewhat,
all of the resources that have been applied to those trees for decades. It's a
it's
lot.
just so bad. It's bad. How
Okay,
bad could it be, Tracy? It can't be any
it's
worse.
so bad.
Yes.
Sorry. Hey, did you mention when you prune the apple trees to improve their spur development?
Well, you do that when they're juvenile, when they're young.
Oh, time
Before-
of season.
Oh, what time of year? Well, I would do it in the dormant season.
In the dormant season? I know that
Yes.
some fruit trees are preferentially pruned in summer in some locations to encourage.
Yeah, I've played with summer pruning, and I guess my thought on that was summer pruning toward invigorating winter spring buds the next year, if I had a reason for that. If I wanted to force growth in a different place in the tree, maybe get the center of the tree to grow more, or if I had some reasons. But for young apple trees, I do most of the pruning in the winter when I can see what I'm doing.
And when Pacific flat-headed borer and other borers are less active, yes?
Yeah, all apple pests.
Yeah. So is there a resource available for the genetic response to pruning of different species? Is there?
No, I wish there was, and that's actually a part of the talk that I took out of this presentation. And that was about my work with the Climate Ready Tree Study in California. We have a really mixed bag of different kinds of tree genetics that we've planted here to see how they tolerate our hotter, drier climate. And I've been in charge of doing the pruning on them. And what I've found is widely different requirements and responses to pruning in the Climate Ready Tree Study. And so it just reemphasizes the point that tree genetics dictate a lot of their pruning response. And so this requires some knowledge, I think, on the part of the practitioner to know what they're going to get when they go in a tree and start doing things. And we can talk very, very theoretically, like I have today, and understand the process from the theoretical side of it. But what happens like with a Chinese pistache that throws branch faults every time it grows?
Right.
It goes like that. It throws out 5 branches every time the stem goes up. Well, you can't leave all 5 on the attachment. That's a failure point. So what is the strategy? Well, you got to get a structure where you don't have 5 branches at every point. And that is just programmed into Chinese pistache. You have to deal with it. What about Bradford pear? Every branch is going straight up. Every single thing is a damn leader. I don't need 30 leaders in a tree. What am I going to do? Well, you got to cut a bunch of them out, and preferably when they're young. So trees with their genetics determine the kind of pruning they need, and you have to be sensitive to that.
Can you speak then now from that point, moving on to branch failure in wind and in general?
This is really an interesting area because we've had some good science from Brian Kane and some other people that have studied how and Ed Gilman even did this, study how trees respond in wind. And what you might think at first is that if you prune trees to thin them out, the wind will go through the tree. And that works until it doesn't, because what happens is you end up kind of lion tailing or creating these long branches. You haven't cut the ends off, and you've taken out branches, thinning cuts, which sounds good, you know, doing the right kind of cut. But when the wind goes through those trees, there's now not enough branches to absorb all the energy. And the remaining branches absorb more energy. So they are more likely to break after being pruned. And so the unintuitive thing there is that pruning doesn't necessarily make a tree safe. And the other corollary of this is that if you are going to try and make a tree safe to wind, what will do it is height reduction pruning. And this does it because basically you have a tree as a lever arm, and has a bending moment at the root plate. And so if there's less height, you have less lever arm. And so you're going to get less full tree failures. And those occur, of course, during high wind and wet soils. So you have the failures at the soil level. So a lot of failures can be lessened by reducing height, but not necessarily by thinning trees so the wind will blow through. That's something that seems very intuitive, like it should be right, but it's not right, because the branches absorb the energy of the wind and they sort of disperse it through the whole canopy. And we know from the videos these guys did, the tree branches are all waving all over the place. Well, that's because they're absorbing the energy of the wind, and that's what they're supposed to do.
Awesome. Can pruning trees in summer, the driest time in California, reduce its susceptibility to fungal infection?
I don't know.
I have a lot of questions, so.
Yeah, okay. That's such a what if, you know, what if you have this variety of tree and that kind of pathogen, and the susceptibilities of all those things, and water status and how the tree's handling it. And I think there's just too many variables to have you a real good answer there.
A couple of our Japanese maples and our Kusa dogwood, both about 12 years in the ground, have dieback or deadwood branches at the bottom of the canopy. Why? And should I prune them off? Thank you.
Probably fungal, and probably you're in a wetter place than I am. And even if you can grow those things, you're in a wetter place, so you have fungal pathogens. How they got started is a bit of an interview. Diagnostics really relies on a lot of historical information, and so we would have to have a discussion on that. But I would say fungal canker diseases, and send me a picture.
Do Japanese maples need special pruning?
They need the kind of pruning that Japanese maples require, which is none.
None.
They need no pruning. So if you have a pruning objective that you want the maple to look a certain way, well, then that's your business. The Japanese maple does not need to be pruned.
This person purchased a potted Fuyu persimmon last spring, but before they could get it into the ground, rodent took up the terminal bud, starting to leaf out, starting to grow, planted in the ground now, 2 feet tall. Will it ever get taller, larger, and will it ever produce?
Yes.
It's a persimmon, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I guess it depends on where you are and whether life for persimmons is good there, but yes. Even though it got its terminal bud whacked, it has the ability to produce a shoot that will take over that role. And persimmons are actually pretty good at this. I've got a bunch of bushwhacked persimmons here in Portal that's exactly what happened, is they got whacked, and I have had to cultivate new terminal leaders to grow the rest of the tree. And so when you see one going straight up, you leave that the F alone. Don't touch it, let it grow, and then build your tree off that as it continues to get more height.
Correctly done. There we go. Can you please talk about pruning with regard to increased yield where I live? A lot of olive trees, oh joy. And the common saying here is that if you don't prune them, they will produce less and eventually stop producing. Ha ha ha.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
who sold you that medicine?
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
No.
In fact, according to Dr. Matt Ritter from San Luis Obispo, the fruitless olive is also a misnomer and buyer beware.
There you go. So the larger the tree gets, the more fruit it will have. This is the case of almost all trees. The unpruned tree will have more fruit than the pruned one. What you may be sensitive to is the size of your olive. If you want that big ass martini olive in your gin, you're not going to get that with the unpruned tree. You're going to want to prune so you have less fruit so that the amount of root nutrients and water goes into fewer fruit and makes them bigger. And that's why we prune trees often, is to increase the quality or to get rid of some of the fruit so it never even forms. And depending on the kinds of cuts we make, we can manipulate the crop. So that's what we do in agriculture. Pruning is usually brutal and frequent, and there are sacrifices for that. Trees in agriculture don't live as long. They are subject to more pathogens. They have more disease in them, and so their useful lifetime is less. And a grower is not going to go out there with a pair of hand clippers and prune 10,000 almond trees. It's just not going to happen. They're going to get a tractor and they're going to get that lawnmower going and they're going to cut it. And they're going to do that because they want to keep the fruiting wood vigorous and have less fruit so that it gets bigger. And that's the basis of most agricultural pruning.
Okay. Sorry, I was distracted reading Rebecca's paragraph. Can you differentiate between a spur and a shoot formed on an apple tree, please?
Yes, a spur is horizontal. It is very stubby. And if I had a picture of it, I would show you, but I don't have one handy. But so they're very slow growing, and spurs lead to flower buds. They will have some leaves too, but the first thing they do in the spring is they pop out flowers. A shoot, like a terminal shoot or even an axillary shoot, it's the first thing it's going to do is have leaves. But there's a caveat here. Apples also produce flowers on terminal shoots. So that's just kind of a weird thing about apples. That's just what they do. But right behind those flowers will be a big leaf bud that's going to keep growing forward and growing up. So spurs usually are axillary. That is, they're in the leaf axils. They're side branches. But spurs are defined as young shoots that don't extend very far. They don't grow very long. They're twiggy little things, nubby stems that don't grow much. And I think actually,
I learned we can't share images.
Okay, so
I was trying to share an
I'm
image
going
of
back
it,
to
but
I'm going back to sharing because actually
Okay.
the title slide has a spur on it. Can we all see the apple tree now?
yes.
I see. So where I'm cutting
Yes.
is the size reduction. This little stem right here is a spur up here. Can we all see that?
I can see it.
Yeah, it's right there with the leaf coming out. That's a spur. And that in the spring, before these leaves came, would have flowers. And if they were pollinated, they would have fruit. But this is a young tree, and so it doesn't have a lot of spurs yet. And so if we do heading cuts, some of these buds will turn into spurs. And the more heading cuts we do, the more spurs we'll have. Then at some, you want to start that after the architecture of the tree is set. You have the major scaffold branches the way you want them. The architecture is the way you like it. Then you can start tipping everything back and having the removal of the apical shoot create the formation of spurs by reducing the auxin level. I'm going to unshare.
Okay. I'm going to get to Rebecca's question next because it's kind of involved. Would you comment on using a sealing material on a cut for a special situation, Texas ebony, Ebenopsis ebano? is very attractive to flat-headed borers in the Phoenix Valley. Not pruning in summer when borers are laying eggs is what they try to do. But summer, even half or less will attract egg laying at the cut. They seem to be moving into live tissue down the stem. She's asking about using waterproof carpenter's glue on the cut edge. And will this suppress attraction to the cut? Do you think
Boy,
that
that is all
larva
100% snake oil right there. I'll tell you what. And
Right.
Ebenopsis ebeno is hardly a tree. It's more like a bush. It's one of the species that's in the climate ready tree study in Davis. And I had the displeasure of having to structurally prune these brutal things when they were young. And they're full of spines and spiky and terrible. And I think out here in the desert, it would be a little different tree. And maybe in Texas, it's a little different tree. I don't have the experience of the pests that you're talking about, but I think what you want is a prophylactic spray of a pesticide that's going to put up a barrier and discourage the insects from entering at certain times of the year. To understand what and how that works would take applied research, trying a bunch of different materials at different rates and replication, and then we would have an idea. And that's the kind of thing extension services do. But I don't know of anybody doing that research, particularly on that tree for that problem. So I can't speak to it. But I think just a wound dressing isn't necessarily going to do it. I think, when you create wounds, you may cover them with a dressing, but that plant is still emitting chemical signals from having been pruned that the dressing isn't going to prevent. The insects are still going to find a way in, and you're still going to have a problem with it. The trick is not to make big cuts, to be doing your pruning early on and guide that terrible thing as a juvenile, small plant into doing what you want it to, so that you don't have to make many cuts and then you don't attract the insects.
So just to be, pesticide responsible, if you do apply a pesticide, it's going to depend on your state and local ordinances and laws. So make sure that you investigate those before ever applying a pesticide. The label is the law in most states, but in California, pesticide application law is even stronger than federal law. So the next question is timing pruning during dormancy or not? Is there time growing during a growing period that is better than another? Does it depend on the type of fruit, conifer, deciduous, native?
Yeah. Next.
Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. So it's like a whole seminar in itself, right?
Given the latitude we have with different species, sure. But, I will say that when I trim trees professionally in California, we would trim anything all year long, with the exception of pines, which we try to defer because of, 5-spine engraver beetles, Ipsipara confusus, that kill pines, particularly Monterey pine in SoCal, which is kind of extinct anyway. But, pruning does create chemical signals that attract insect pests. And so we have to be somewhat sensitive to time of year on that. That being said, I've heard other entomologists say, well, it's warm enough in Southern California that those beetles are flying all year anyway. Yeah, well, wintertime, it's not as warm. The volatiles aren't as in the air because, it's cooler. And so you're going to be less attractive. So there are some rules like that. And then other trees, I don't think I would trim a tree that is real sensitive, like maples or something, in the springtime or oaks when they're doing their new growth. I just think that's a wrong time to be pruning things like that.
Need that
And
energy.
you're going to do more damage in the canopy to the growth that you're trying to preserve by knocking things against it and that sort of thing. So you'd want to wait till new growth hardens off. And then in a lot of production circumstances, and even in ornamental trees, after the tree has fruited is often a good time to prune, because that's a time when green shoots are going to pop out. So if we're going to try and guide how a tree is developing, after fruiting is a good time to prune. So those are general
Plums are supposedly to be pruned in summer, says Ralph, to avoid silver leaf if winter pruned. Thoughts? I'm not aware of what silver leaf is. Are you?
Yes, but it's not a disorder that I deal with. I'm kind of wondering where Ralph is from.
If Ralph is still here, maybe he will say.
But what was the question actually?
It was kind of complicated, convoluted, I guess. Plums are supposedly to be pruned in summer to avoid silver leaf if winter pruned. I think he's saying that they get it if they're pruned in winter.
Huh.
And do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a little beyond my knowledge.
Okay.
I don't have experience with that. So.
Eucalyptus trees topped in the manner that we have already discussed. Yeah. Now it's growing a bunch of large branches. Doesn't look healthy. Great horned owl has a nest on the flat part of the trunk that was cut. I think they're worried about limb failure. Expect tree failure.
I guess
How many years out would you expect it? Well, it's a eucalyptus, so last week.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Wait till the owl is not around and deal with it. But yeah.
So it's basically the same situation where you would selectively prune unstably attached material, and a professional arborist could potentially restructure that tree crown, but it
might suggest getting rid of the tree and starting over too.
Well, as a habitat tree, we may be motivated
to
keep it.
I mean, if the tree is not going to hit something, if it fails, then why get too upset? If it's right next to a structure it's going to damage, then there's more cause for pruning.
If several pines that were planted too close to the driveway and too many trees for the space, they have planted 15 plus years ago, can I prune the lower branches that hang over the driveway without damaging the tree?
I guess it depends on what pine, where you're living, and what your water resources are, but my inclination would be to remove whole trees, preserve the architecture of the ones you like, and thin out the stand, because typically these things get overplanted and there's enough resource while they're growing young saplings, but as they start to mature, there's not enough resource for everybody. And so you want to perhaps remove every other one and then work with that. Now you're pruning along the driveway, of course, it's going to be for vehicular clearance. And I guess my comment would be, it depends on the tree, because some pine trees will regrow from cut branches and others won't. So if you cut some branches like of Pinus radiata, which is a Monterey pine, they're just going to die back after you cut the terminal off. And if you cut Canary Island pine back, it's going to sprout. And there's a few other pines that'll do that too, but kind of need to know a little bit more.
Does California have emerald ash borer? No.
No, thank God, but we're worried about it.
Are you recommending any species or varieties of ash, Fraxinus?
Well, I'll tell you I'm not, but there's a few I'm very interested in. For instance, there's the native ash that grows in the San Bernardino, San Gabriel, and Los Padres National Forest. And I think it's Fraxinus californica. And it's a small tree. It doesn't get real big. It's barely more than a shrub. But I'm thinking that one has some really nice horticultural aspects I'd like to see as a patio tree or a small space tree. The Fraxinus velutina, which is the Arizona ash, of course, grows out here. And it's an amazing tree. And it tolerates low humidity, high temperatures. Of course, it likes water because it grows along the creeks. But it was adopted by industry 50 years ago, and it's in industry. And so it's a nice tree. The tree that's probably problematic is the chamois ash, Mexican ash, Fraxinus udii. And that's a tree that just gets too big for most people's spaces. And so it's a space allocation. Again, a nice tree, but it also has structural pruning needs because it gets a lot of codominant stems that will break.
favorite. It's one of my favorites. The Western
Beautiful
US
tree.
is expecting a mega drought. What would you recommend to a tree owner to keep their trees alive under drought restricted water conditions? That's a great question.
It sure is. And partly that's a leading question to the next webinar. So we're going to talk about cultivating trees and how to grow trees and things that we can do. And it's largely going to come down to mulch, mulch, mulch. And mulching is so good for trees, and how we do it and how often and what we use. But a surface mulch that prevents evaporation from the soil surface is going to save applied water, so you're not having water evaporate away. And then it's going to prevent the buildup of salt near the surface of the soil that affects roots that want to grow there. So there's just a lot of reasons why mulch is good, and we're going to cover that in the next webinar.
Awesome. Also, I hope you'll speak to the fact that trees benefit from watering in advance of the heat wave at the next webinar. I have a young 2-year-old macadamia nut tree. It has 3 liters. I was just getting ready to prune 1 liter, but now, since listening to this, she's thinking about leaving it alone. Any compelling reason to prune?
Well, yeah, if they're competing leaders, you probably don't want to have them grow into full-size codominant equal leaders. So you would tip one.
I
And
couldn't do that. I'm not
yeah,
sure do that
tip,
intentionally.
take one knuckle off of one of them and leave
One
the other one alone and let it become the dominant one. And then later on, you may end up even removing it entirely. If you can kind of see the future and know what you're doing, you might remove the thing entirely now. The thing about this is, though, if you go back to the 2 rules of pruning, pruning is a growth retarding process. Maybe you don't want to retard the growth of your tree right now. So you want to keep some of that leader, even though it's competing, just to feed into the overall growth rate of the tree. So fine, go ahead and cut it back a little bit. It will grow less, the other one will grow more, and continue doing that over time and eventually remove the whole thing.
We're narrowing it down. So can you make some general comments about root pruning?
Yeah, root pruning is really interesting. You know, root pruning occurs in nature. And if you live in anywhere that has a riparian corridor, you see how water has just exposed, washed away, broken roots. And the trees have their roots in the stream bank, the remaining roots, and they look great. The trees are healthy. They got all this damaged root system on one side, but the whole tree looks pretty good. And you go, well, how can that be? Well, first of all, roots don't necessarily feed a particular branch. So a root goes into the tree and it serves the entire tree. And then I think I made the point last time that root systems are unevenly distributed usually. So they don't have the same architecture as the branches. And we can lose roots, we can prune roots. And I think the best data we have on this is all of the city root pruning that's been done by cities everywhere. When they have to replace sidewalk and curbs and gutters, they prune roots. And surprisingly, a lot of trees don't die. They may not grow as fast for a while, or they may stop growing, or they may get canker diseases and get sick because of that root pruning, but they don't die. And so trees are amazingly tolerant of root pruning. Do I think you should root prune? Not just because you feel like it. Again, you got to have a reason for it. Can we get away with pruning roots? Yes. Will the decay be entering through roots? Yes, sometimes. I'm thinking again of that Ficus microcarpa that I showed you, the branch collar with the reaction zone and the, you know, how it was defending against the increasing Botrysphaeria. Well, you know, there's Ganodermas that get in Ficus microcarpa in the roots, and they come from root pruning. And so even though you can root prune, you have to remember you are creating a wound that will allow pathogens in. So depending on the species you have and the kinds of pathogens that those trees get, it could be more or less a good or a bad idea.
And remember that this is not the same pruning as you might be doing to correct bad architecture of the root system for a transplant.
Yeah, and that's a completely different thing. We're doing much smaller cuts relatively, and the tree can usually at that age can recover quickly and cover that over, and it's not going to get infected per se.
So this person is stating that their master gardeners or trainer is telling them to snap off the tip of the avocado branch to shape the tree. What are your thoughts? Mine was no.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, your thumb and forefinger can be a pruning device if you're doing young shoots. And doing it with clippers, snapping it, as you say, if you have a legitimate reason for doing that, I'm fine with it. If you've got a pruning goal you're trying to make, and you have a reason that you've figured out that works, that is necessary, that's great. If you don't need to buy equipment to prune a tree, go for it.
Right?
And
I mean,
I like the idea that you're making small cuts, not big ones, when you're just equipped with your fingers.
but it all goes back to the why are you being instructed to remove a terminal end, a shoot apical meristem? So that's where you have to know what your purpose is.
Yeah, and what the architecture is going to be. And some of those avocados are pretty wambly. They just sort of grow all over the place. And maybe the idea is to, bunch up the growth a bit, get more shoots to form. I don't know.
Our Ralph from our previous question is in the UK, by the way.
Oh, yeah. So, you're in a different land, and I'm not going to be familiar with the pests there. But I guess some research into that particular pest,
That
silverleaf.
was the silver leaf.
Yeah, whether it's mites or thrips or a fungal pathogen, I'm not even sure. I just remember hearing about something like that in plums, and so
I'll do a little research on that.
yeah, maybe we can get back together, Ralph, on that privately, and I can give you some help.
Our Susan Trong asks, because I know you want to really answer, Susan, for fruit trees, is there a better pruning method than others, like the U-shape or V-shape pruning?
Do you mean on the cut or the whole tree?
Whole tree.
Yeah,
Inverted vase form.
they call it open vase and modified central leader and central leader. So those are the three main types, and everything except the central leader is terrible. And it's because you end up promoting branches that are same size as what they're attached to, and or codominants that are the same thing, branches the same size as the other branch. So if you can't space the branches, if they're all coming from the same place, that's a branch fault. And how do we prevent the tree from falling apart? You're pruning the hell out of it every winter. You're never letting it get big. And for a fruit tree like a peach tree, fine. And then a lot of times people put 2x4s under them anyway when they get a lot of fruit on them, and they keep them from breaking that way. So you're basically managing the failure in time. It's better if you put an architecture on a peach tree that promotes strength in the branches. But who would ever think to do that? Those pruning designs were made to put light in the center of the tree and invigorate buds to produce fruit buds. And that was the whole point of it. It wasn't to produce an architecture in the tree that's sustainable. So again, in doing my own peaches, I don't follow that pruning architecture.
And I'm moving away from it. And yesterday, the branch that I did not support on my historically inverted vase pruned plum tree lost a major branch full of fruit because of my original bad pruning before I was an arborist and knew better.
And you kind of, you're managing that. It's funny, people have those predetermined ideas for what a fruit tree should be looking like, and then they would manage the failure over time by putting sticks under it because they know they're going to break. It's just that people didn't see the way forward to produce a tree that won't break, and we can do that.
Just so we know, Annemiek has told us that the silver leaf is a fungal pathogen called Contractor
Chondrosterium, yeah.
purpureum, and it forms conchs in the fall and spring. Thank you, Enemy.
Yeah, that I know that from my plant pathology heritage, but I don't live that pathogen because I never see it.
Right, yeah.
And so again, maybe if Ralph gives me an email, we'll loop Annemiek into the discussion because she's a plant pathologist new to the University of California, but with a lot of small fruit expertise from the Midwest of the United States. So she has a different group of pathogens in her brain that she's well familiar with.
John White is asking about ebony, might be lush. Phoenix is pretty much frost free. Ebony may never go dormant. I'm not sure there's a question here. Careful on excess yeah, I'm not really seeing a question other than management comments. So
yeah, the comments are great. We do appreciate them. But questions are easier to answer.
yeah. When pruning a pluot with 3 varieties, so a fruit
Uh-huh.
salad tree, how do you decide how to prune it?
I would make one cut right at the ground. That would be my approach, or 2 cuts and leave 1 variety in place. I don't favor multiple varieties on the same tree, and the reason why is when you graft a scion to a rootstock, there is some measure of incompatibility. It may be 90% compatible and you don't even see a difference, but it might be 70% compatible or 50% compatible. And all varieties are just a little bit different in their compatibility with whatever rootstock they're put on. And so what ends up happening is some varieties in that multiply grafted tree are going to overgrow the others. And then what happens? You have to be really keen on your pruning and understand that pruning is a growth retarding process. And so you'll prune the crap out of that one that's nicely matched to the scion. And the ones that are incompatible, you're not going to prune those at all because you want them to grow the most. So if you're ready to take that on and understand all that theory and apply that theory correctly in that tree to those different scions, go for it. I find it easier to throw 3 different trees in the same hole if you want to go that way. It's still the same problem because the 3 trees will grow at different rates and you're back to pruning some more than others to maintain the balance. So it's all about balance. It's really well balanced when there's 1 scion on 1 rootstock. Then it's easy.
Interestingly, my Asian apple grafted to my Fuji apple grafted to my Anna apple has broken dormancy and my Anna apple has not.
Well, now that's just wrong.
Isn't that creepy? So
Anna's like blooming all year. It's like never goes dormant.
These were planted as whips 2 years ago, so they're very juvenile. We have exhausted our question bank at this moment. So
I can't believe it. So for those 100 people who are still on the webinar, thank you for sticking in here. And you may have a question later that didn't occur to you, or maybe it was just not appropriate to ask because I have to see pictures. I love to get your emails. It's been really fun to talk to people from back east and other places. And I may not know the answer to your question, but I may have an opinion. And so I might be able to help you. I do want to re-emphasize as we close down, if you are in need of professional help, be sure to hire certified, qualified professional help. Don't hire your gardener to prune your trees unless he can show you a, Bachelor of Science degree from some horticultural agricultural university where he specialized in understanding pruning. Get somebody who's, professionally trained to do it and or to give you advice on how to do it. And, this is something I didn't come to appreciate until very late in life. And it has nothing to do with trees. I have horses, and an old cowboy taught me how to basically trim hooves. So I learned how to trim horse hooves, and I've done it for decades. I know how to trim horse feet. But then one of my horses had needs and it had to be shoed or shod. And so I'm basically a cheap ass and I didn't want to hire the farrier to do it. But I thought there was some value in having the vet train me on how to shoe horses. So I paid the vet to train me how to cold shoe horses. That was some damn well good spent money. You know, knowledge is worth something. If you have to pay to get the knowledge, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Hire somebody to teach you how to do it right. And you're going to have to find that person, of course, but it's worth it to pay to get information that's correct, that's insightful, that's going to give you the answer. And, you know, you can a lot of times get it from your extension service. If you have that near you, you can get qualified people to tell you this stuff and it's free. Hallelujah. But don't feel like it's a bad thing to have to buy good advice. And I can't emphasize that enough. We undervalue knowledge. Knowledge really is power. It's the power to do the right thing. And it's the power not to do the wrong thing. And it keeps us from getting into so much trouble horticulturally and ruining the lives of trees, which we don't want to do.
We also have to remember that this is an evolving science and new information is coming out. New arborists, really much older arborists who may not be refreshing their information. You want to really critically analyze the arborists' skill sets and whether or not they have advanced their skills over the years of their tenure, because there is a lot of new information now.
Yeah, ask to see some of their work in the neighborhood. Say, well, where's a tree I can look at that you worked on? And then go look at it. I've given you the skills in this presentation, and the recording will be available to identify good pruning. You know, if you see flush cuts in a tree, you don't want that guy or that gal. You know, you want somebody who's doing good quality cuts, who's doing them frequently and not doing them large, all the things we talked about. So you have the skills to identify good pruning now.
And equipment is not necessarily an indicator of skills. So clean trucks, brand new equipment may not mean that that's a skilled arborist. So beware on all levels.
That could be somebody who just got in the business.
Well, I mean, we have somebody in town where I live right now who has beautiful equipment, and he's just doing the worst pruning that I've seen in so long. Flat cuts on mature trees. It's just horrible. So, you know, nice equipment also is not necessarily the litmus. You have a repetitive question I've been meaning to ask you, and Carol has been waiting, so I want to make sure to ask you this. Can you consider doing another webinar specifically on pruning fruit and citrus trees?
Well, I think maybe. Fruit trees for sure. Citrus trees is also an evolving thing. You know, for the first 15 years of my career, I used to tell people all the time, oh, we don't prune citrus trees. We don't prune citrus trees. Well, then the Israelis, being crazy, went and started pruning all their citrus trees. And they showed that quality of fruit improves dramatically when you prune your citrus trees. So now that's a standard. And then there are all kinds of other reasons why you prune citrus. But I think what I would like to do on a meeting like that would be to bring in my colleague, Ben Faber, who is our citrus advisor and production subtropical horticulture advisor. And he understands pruning from an agricultural perspective and also pruning of citrus. And so, yeah, it's a good suggestion. And sure, we could do a specialized webinar on that.
Which cat is that you have back there?
That's Oliver. Is he back there? Oh,
Oliver. Yes, the video will be available soon. What about crepe myrtles?
Well, crepe myrtle's a glorified bush. Crepe myrtle, if you notice, even the good solid trees, they want to sprout from the roots because they're basically a shrub. And so crepe myrtle is one of the few trees that I'll say, okay, go ahead and have a multi. If you have to have a multi, go ahead and have a crepe myrtle multi. If you just got to do it and there's no, you know, you're so compelled, you got to have a multi tree, make it be a crepe myrtle, please. Because they're basically shrubs. So they flower on the new growth, and heading cuts can really make those things spectacular because you push a lot of new growth, you get a lot of flowers.
My Crepe
Still,
Myrtles didn't, break dormancy until July last year,
oh my goodness.
right?
Oh, I remember when we were at the National Arboretum looking at their Crepe Myrtle section. Gorgeous trees, giant things, you know, beautiful stem colors. The LA County Arboretum has some beautiful species Crepe Myrtles as well. And so, yeah, they're great trees, and they're pretty drought tolerant too. For our hotter, drier climate, they need some water, and they would like mulch, but they're pretty tough. So it's a great tree, basically. What else can I say? I don't know.
I don't either. So
Anything
we're
else?
pretty much exhausted the questions as far as I can see, and we're down to, gosh, a lowly 88 participants at this point.
Well, next week's webinar is on how to grow trees. And our mantra for the webinar is don't just plant trees, grow trees. And we started it during Arbor Week, Arbor Day, and Earth Day. Started on Earth Day, followed with Arbor Day, and we're kind of in that season when people are planting trees, even though it may not be the best time to plant trees, but whatever. Planting trees is great, but grow trees. So next time we're going to talk about how to really grow them. And with the exception of pruning. Tracy, you're muted. Do you mean to be muted?
Probably good.
Oh, okay.
Multi-stem Western redbud tree in the question and answer now.
Yeah, redbuds are also glorified shrubs. So, you know, just plant them, leave them alone, don't do anything. Head them back now and then if you want more flowers. Redbuds don't require a lot of pruning.
And that should be it.
Yeah. So in essence, trees don't need to be pruned, folks. People need to prune trees. Just have some good reasons and do it correctly. And with that, we'll see you next week for how to grow trees, the best part of it. All right.
Thanks
Take care,
for coming,
everybody.
everyone.
Yeah. Bye.